Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most epic and, honestly, one of the strangest battle stories in the entire Bible, the fall of Jericho. It's a story that has fascinated people for millennia, not just because a city fell, but because of how it fell. This wasn't your typical military siege with battering rams and catapults. This was something entirely different, something that challenges our modern ideas of power, strategy, and what it truly means to win. So let's set the scene. The Israelites, after 40 long years of wandering in the desert, are finally on the doorstep of the Promised Land. Moses has passed the torch to his successor, Joshua, a man described as being full of the spirit of wisdom. And right in front of them, blocking their path, stands the formidable city of Jericho. Now, Jericho wasn't just any old town. Archaeologically and biblically, it's described as a fortress. It had massive, imposing walls. Some sources suggest even double walls, making it seem virtually impenetrable by the standards of the day. For the Israelites, a group of former slaves who had been nomads for a generation, this city was a giant, intimidating symbol of the challenges that lay ahead. From a purely human perspective, the odds were stacked impossibly high against them. This is where things get really interesting. God gives Joshua the battle plan. And if you were a military general, you would probably fire the person who came up with this strategy. God doesn't say, build siege towers or find a weak spot in the wall. Instead, he gives a set of instructions that sound more like a religious procession than a military assault. He tells Joshua to have the army, led by 7 priests carrying 7 trumpets made of ram's horns, march around the city once a day for 6 days. In front of them would go the Ark of the Covenant, the very symbol of God's presence with his people. The instructions were specific. The armed men would march, the priests would blow the trumpets, and everyone else was to remain completely silent. No battle cries, no taunts, just the sound of marching feet and blaring horns. Can you imagine what that must have been like? For 6 straight days, the people of Jericho would have looked down from their massive walls and seen this bizarre parade. It probably went from being intimidating on day 1 to confusing on day 2. And maybe even laughable by day 4 or 5. They might have thought, is this it? Is this the great army we've been hearing about? They're just walking in circles. The silence from the Israelite camp would have been unnerving. It was a psychological game, but not one devised by human cunning. It was a divine strategy designed to build anticipation and, more importantly, to test and build the faith of the Israelites themselves. Think about the discipline and obedience it took for an entire nation to follow these strange orders without question, day after day. They had to trust that God knew what he was doing, even when it made no logical sense. Then comes the 7th day. The instructions change. On this day, they are to march around the city not once, but 7 times. 7 priests, 7 trumpets, 7 days. 7 times around. The number 7 in the Bible is often associated with divine completion and perfection. This wasn't just a random number. It was symbolic. God was bringing his plan to its perfect conclusion. After the 7th lap on the 7th day, the priests were to give one long, final blast on their trumpets, at that signal. And only at that signal Joshua commanded the people to shout, and not just any shout, but a great shout, a roar of victory released after a week of disciplined silence. And at that moment, the Bible says the walls came tumbling down. The text says they fell down flat, allowing the Israelite army to charge straight into the city from every side. The impenetrable fortress was breached not by human force, but by divine power, unleashed through the radical obedience and faith of God's people. The victory was swift and total, just as God had promised. He had told Joshua from the very beginning, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men." The victory was spoken of in the past tense before the first step was even taken. It was already a done deal. The marching and the shouting was simply the Israelites walking into a victory that God had already secured for them. So, what's the big takeaway for us today from this incredible story? It's not just a cool historical account. It's a profound lesson about where true strength comes from. The fall of Jericho is a powerful demonstration that God's ways are not our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. The world tells us to rely on our own strength, our intelligence, our resources, our military might. But the story of Jericho teaches us that victory in the things that truly matter, the Jerichos in our own lives, comes from a different source. It comes from radical faith and radical obedience to God, even when His instructions seem illogical or unconventional. Think about the walls in your own life. Maybe it's a challenge that seems insurmountable, a habit you can't break, a relationship that seems broken beyond repair, or a dream that feels impossibly far away. We try to knock these walls down with our own strength, our own strategies, and we end up exhausted and discouraged. The story of Jericho invites us to consider a different approach. What if, instead of trying harder, we listened more closely to God's direction? What if we chose to obey Him, even when it feels strange or counterintuitive? What if we replaced our frantic efforts with faithful, consistent, step-by-step obedience, trusting that He is the one who will bring down the walls? The silence of the Israelites for 6 days is also a powerful lesson. In our noisy, chaotic world, we often feel the need to be constantly talking, planning, and striving. But sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is to be still and silent before God, letting Him lead. That silence wasn't passive. It was an active expression of trust and dependence. It was a declaration that their hope was not in their own voice or their own strength, but in God alone. Their eventual shout was not a cry of desperation. It was a shout of faith, releasing the power that God had been building up all week. Ultimately, the glory for the victory at Jericho went to God, and God alone. The Israelites couldn't boast and say, "Our military strategy was brilliant," or "Our army was just too strong." All they could do was look at the rubble of a mighty fortress and say, "God did this." It reoriented their entire perspective. It took them, right at the beginning of their conquest of the Promised Land, that every victory they would ever achieve would be because of His presence and His power, not their own. So, as we reflect on this story, let's ask ourselves, where are we relying on our own battering rams instead of on God's power? What unconventional strategies might God be calling us to in our own lives? It might be a call to consistent prayer, to an act of radical forgiveness, to a step of generosity, or simply to be still and trust Him in the middle of a storm. The fall of Jericho reminds us that with God, the impossible becomes possible, and the greatest victories are won not through might, but through faith. Thanks so much for watching today. I hope this story encourages you as much as it encourages me. If you found this message helpful, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more content like this. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What Jerichos are you facing? And how does this story change your perspective? Let's continue the conversation down there. God bless, and I'll see you in the next video.